Now, polygenic inheritance is another type of inheritance that kind of defies the mold. So this is where there's more than one gene, where these genes all kind of code for a certain amount of something. It could be growth hormone or pigment. And then at the end, you kind of sum up all the various stuff that's been produced, and that determines your actual phenotype. Now, because there's so many genes involved, in many cases for like height or for skin tone, skin color, you're going to see that you have 10, maybe more genes involved. So as each gene kind of codes for a little bit more of something or not more, at the end, we now get this gradient where there's lots of different possibilities based upon what you had for gene 1, gene 2, gene 3, gene 4, etc. And so instead of just getting where we have tall and short, we now have essentially a whole spectrum. And so when you look at it, you oftentimes tend to see more of like a bell curve where there are certain heights that are more common, but then there's also plenty that are on either side of this that are relatively common. So when we look at skin tone, we don't just have like dark and light. We've got dark, light, and everything in between. So whenever you see that there appears to be no like set amounts of something where it just seems to be that you can be anywhere along this gradient or spectrum, you should normally assume that this is going to be polygenic inheritance. This is very, very common, especially in humans and other organisms, for a lot of our traits. So don't assume that it's rare. The more we study genetics, the more we see that oftentimes multiple genes kind of interplay and interconnect with each other to determine the final phenotype. So in humans, eye color, hair color, there's lots of things that we like to treat as though they are done by a single gene, but in reality, as we study them more, we find out that they're actually caused by multiple genes, which explains the fact that there's different shades of blue, or there's a grayish, and there's green and hazel and brown. Things tend to be genetically more complex than we'd like them to be. Now, lastly, before we kind of switch into much more chromosomal stuff, we've got this idea of nature versus nurture you might have heard, where genes are a big part of determining what you become. You know, what alleles you possess, your genotype, does largely determine what you look like, your phenotype. However, there are also situations where what you're exposed to, the environment, also affects what we do, what we look like. And so one of the ways of studying nature versus nurture, whether the way that you look is because your genetics said that your skin was going to, age a little bit worse and sag, is that because of that? Or is it because I've been a smoker all my life and smoking, all that exposure to all these environmental toxins can also lead to that? So we can start to try to kind of figure out, is this a genetic issue or is this an exposure environmental issue? And one of the cool ways to kind of determine what's at fault, is it, my alleles, or is it my diet, good or bad, my lack of exercise or good exercise, exposure to sunlight, temperature. There's all kinds of stuff here that can have an effect environmentally. So we've kind of turned to identical twins, called twin studies, to look at this. Because when you look at identical twins, they came from the same sperm and they came from the same egg or ovum. So ultimately, they have the exact same genes. So the fact that they look so similar, we can pin down to that's the genetic part, that's the alleles, that's the genotype that's influencing their overall phenotypes. But the fact that they're not identical, we can pin down to the fact that the environment's having an influence. And so we can see that oftentimes one twin is a bit taller. We can see one of them might be a bit heavier. One of them might get a disease like cancer versus the other one. So if we know that one twin smoked and ultimately that twin got lung cancer, it makes it pretty clear that that's not a genetic thing. That's going to be likely an environmental thing. If we can see that one twin ate a much worse diet than the other twin and that twin's shorter or that twin's heavier, then we can pin this where it's not the genetics necessarily that individual that's saying, let's be short or this particular height or let's put on weight. A lot of it can be the environment and what they've been exposed to over the course of their life. And so right now we're still trying to figure this out because a lot of things appear to be a mixture of both. That your genetics kind of give you a range with which you can work with based upon what you're exposed to in your environment. So if you have where your environment's great and you have a good diet and you're ultimately taking care of yourself, you might find yourself on the good end of it. Maybe if we're saying height, you get to be the max height possible. Whereas if you have to suffer through things, maybe there's some famine, there's some other issues, you might end up towards the bottom end of that because genetics isn't as concrete as we thought. We're seeing more and more that other things are at play here, including environmental exposure to all kinds of different things.